I'm the coordinator of our Campus American Democracy Project. Joining us today is one of our other ADP American Democracy Project campuses, Weber State and Ogden, Utah. So they're going to join us for this afternoon. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and administration, I welcome you to Keene State College. Central to our mission as the public liberal arts school of New Hampshire and our commitment to academic excellence and public service, Keene State has partnered with the American Democracy Project, an initiative begun in 2003 by the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. The American Democracy Project is a nonpartisan, multi-campus initiative focused on higher education's role in preparing the next generation of active and engaged citizens for our democracy. As one of over 220 participating campuses and universities, Keene State has developed a variety of faculty, staff, and student initiatives aimed at engaging students in becoming active citizens and fostering a passion for civic engagements beyond their college years. It is consistent with our mission and our work with the American Democracy Project to open our campus as a space of public dialogue, to discuss issues critical to our democracy, and engage our faculty, staff, students, and the Keene community in the political process. I'd like to welcome our KSC Student Dem President, David Bernstein, to introduce our candidate for today.
So today it's my privilege to introduce you to Marianne Williamson. Marianne is an author, lecturer, healer, and activist. Her 13th book, The Politics of Love, a handbook for New American Revolution, we published in April and will no doubt enjoy the success of her other 7 New York Times bestsellers and 4 #1 bestsellers, including Healing the Soul of America, which just reissued its 20th anniversary edition. Marianne's books and lectures have inspired and empowered millions. Additionally, she put her words into action as an activist working on the issues of AIDS, poverty, and peace. In 2010, she founded the Sister Giant Conference to empower women to run for office. In 2014, she ran for Congress, and today she is running for the presidency of the United States. Her campaign goes to the heart of what ails our democracy, and we are delighted to welcome her and hear her vision for transforming our politics and governance. Please join me in welcoming Marianne Williamson.
Thank you for having me here. I'm so grateful, and I'm honored to be part of this process. One of the 1,736 people running for the Democratic presidency. I'm grateful. I know that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're listening to everybody. You're going to have a whole year of listening before you walk into that booth and make a vote. I'm made very aware when I'm in other states what's a caucus versus what's a vote versus a primary. I personally think it's very healthy for our democracy that so many people are running. I think it's very healthy for the Democratic Party that so many people are running. I don't see myself as running against anyone. I'm running with everyone. And everyone who's running, I'm sure feels as I do. What I'm sure everybody in this room feels. That we just want to show up as best we can and serve in whatever way we can in what is obviously a very important moment in our history. I'm one of the people, which I assume at least most of you are, if not all of you, that feels that this is a real crisis moment in American history. But I feel that our way to navigate these times has to do, in large part, with our recognizing how what is happening now fits into a larger narrative of American history. Basically, I feel that what happened in 1776 is what we need to remember. In order to go forward most powerfully, I think we need to reclaim some of what happened at the very, very beginning. In 1776, we repudiated aristocracy, and we need to repudiate it again. There's something very radical about the American experiment. There's something very radical about democracy, and there's something very radical about love. And it is in reclaiming the radicalism of both love and democracy that I believe we will achieve the wisdom and the moral force to take us through these times and to be successful on behalf of our children and our children's children. There's a difference between wealth and aristocracy. Wealth is a good thing. We like it that people can get rich in America. The problem in America today is not that some people get rich. The problem is that not enough people get a chance to. And there is a difference between that and aristocracy. Aristocracy is when the entire governmental system is set up in such a way as to aid the very rich in their ability to get richer and makes it more difficult for anyone else to get into the club. That means when you make that transition from a government that is advocating for equal opportunity for the majority of its citizens to a government advocating, as ours does today, more for short-term profit maximization for a tiny portion of our population and the multinational corporate conglomerates that they so often represent. You're not talking about a functioning democracy. You are talking about, in our time, a corporate aristocracy. And when, in the past, this country has been faced with the undemocratic, unjust behavior of capitalism, when it has become untethered from its ethical and moral core, in the greatest tradition of the American democracy, we have pushed back against that. That's why we have child labor laws. That's why we have labor unions. That's why we had Glass-Steagall. That's why we have antitrust and anti-monopoly laws. This is part of a large continuum, a large narrative. Over time, Americans do tend to get it right. We had slavery in this country, but then we also had abolition. We had the suppression of women in this country, but then we also had two major waves of feminism and the women's suffragette movement. We had institutionalized white supremacy and segregation in this country, but then we had the civil rights movement. This is not the first generation of Americans to have to deal with this stuff. This is not the first generation to have to deal with these assaults against our democratic foundations that have been with us from the beginning. Even the founders. On one hand, they established the most enlightened principles that have ever infused the country, and 41 of them were slave owners. So that dichotomy has been with us. It's baked into the cake. Other generations, when they have needed to, at their time, corrected this country. This is not the first generation to have to deal with this stuff. Let's just not be the first generation to wimp out on doing what it takes to get this country back on track. And that will not happen with just a better version of same old, same old. Not today, ladies and gentlemen, because too much of the political establishment on the both and the left on the left as well as on the right, has been infused, has been playing footsies under the table with the corporate aristocrats, has felt that in order for them to be funded the way they need to be funded, you have one major party that's brazen about the whole thing at this point. They have an attitude of what of it. They actually agree and believe that that kind of veiled aristocracy is a better organizing principle for the society. The other major political party is just so upset about the whole thing. The other major political party wrings its hands, and this is just terrible, isn't it? And too often, however, even though it will address the peripheral pain that this causes people, too often is not willing to challenge the underlying forces that make all that pain inevitable. And it is time, I grew up at a time when the Democratic Party had real soul. I grew up at a time when there was no moral equivocation there whatsoever. I grew up at a time when the Democratic Party knew what it stood for. And you can't, at this point, go both ways. It's one thing to compromise in politics. That's the art. And this is America, and we don't all agree. But you must not compromise with your vision. And this is time. You know, in the Jewish religion, it says that every generation must discover God for itself. And every generation of Americans must discover democracy for ourselves. This idea that all men are created equal, that all men are granted by God unalienable rights of life, of liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and that governments are instituted among men to secure those rights. And then if you add to those first principles from the Declaration, the words of Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, that ours is to be a government of the people, and by the people, and for the people. It's not enough for words like those to simply be inscribed on marble walls in Washington. It's not enough for them to just be written in parchment and put under glass somewhere in a museum. Those principles must be inscribed on our hearts, or they lose their moral force. And when they are inscribed in our hearts, and every single generation plays this out, because every generation from the beginning has those whose hearts are ablaze with what those things mean, and those who just find the whole thing inconvenient for whatever reason. When your hearts are ablaze with those things, you're coming from a bigger place than I want what I want. And you're coming from a bigger place than even our generation getting what it wants. We need to awaken morally and spiritually. What is going on with this magnificent, precious gift of democracy is something much bigger than you getting what you want, or you getting what you want, or me getting what I want. It's much bigger even than this generation. We are the inheritors of something so profound on this planet. We've never gotten it all right. No generation of Americans, we've never been everything that we say that we are. But there has been, for the most part, a through line where it was obvious to the citizens of this country and to the people of the world that we at least aspired. We at least tried. We are living at a time where we have entire generations growing up. They don't even have a historical memory of a time when we really committed to living the principles on which we purport to stand. And we have entire generations, not only of Americans growing up, but people all around the world who don't remember a time when they saw the United States of America as a great champion of democracy, when they saw the United States of America as a true force of moral leadership. We cannot even wait and say, well, our children will take care of it. It is too late in the game. We are too close to the cliff. But ladies and gentlemen, we need to do more than back up from the cliff. We need to get out of the vicinity of the cliff altogether. Now, we all know what has happened, and we know that it's been going on for about 40 years. We know that the entire government has been infused by a certain economic philosophy. And that economic philosophy says that if we just make short-term profit maximization for huge corporate forces the basic bottom line of our economic functioning, and then there's been an unholy alliance between that philosophy and the fact that because of the nefarious influence of money on the way our government operates, our government has become, in too many cases, little more than a system of legalized bribery. And it does not advocate for the people so much as it advocates for those short-term profits. That's why, instead of taking care of our planet, our EPA works more for short-term profit maximization of fossil fuel companies. Why the head of our EPA is an ex-chemical company executive, and before that was an ex-oil company executive. It's why the first Secretary of State in this administration was the ex-CEO of Exxon, and why the current acting head of the U.S. Defense Department was a 30-year executive at Boeing. This is not a covert corporate takeover of the U.S. government. It's an overt corporate takeover of the U.S. government. But what I want to talk to you about is the human devastation that this hath wrought. Underneath phrases like wealth inequality, underneath hard data, like the fact that only a tiny portion of our population controls 50% of the wealth. Underneath the data even of the fact that the average American has $4,000 in savings. 57% of Americans have only $1,000 to their names. This causes a level of economic despair and tension and anxiety so great as to produce something like the phenomenon of Donald Trump. If we do not answer this, and we do not answer it fundamentally, it could produce something even worse. If you don't take care of your marriage, don't be surprised if you lose your marriage. If you don't take care of your body, don't be surprised if you lose your health. And if you don't take care of your business, don't be surprised if you lose your business. Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't take care of your democracy, don't go being surprised when someone else would try to grab it from you. So what we have right now is a situation where large groups of desperate people, whether it is on a corner of an American city or a corner of the world, are basically a national security risk because large groups of desperate people do desperate things. Let's talk about some of those large groups of desperate people. Millions of American children live with chronic trauma. In every state of this country, there are thousands and thousands of children who go to school every single day at schools that do not even meet minimum safety standards, in schools where in the classrooms
there are not the adequate supplies to teach a child to read. If a child cannot read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation is drastically decreased. If a child cannot learn to read by 8, the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. Many of these children live in what's called America's domestic war zones, where the violence in their families, on their streets, and in their communities is so great that psychologists tell us the PTSD that is experienced by returning Afghan and Iraq vets is no more severe than the PTSD experienced by these millions of American children. And with a war veteran, it's post-traumatic. With these children, it's present traumatic because it is triggered and re-triggered every single day. I'm talking to you in a state where you already are very well aware of the consequences of an opioid epidemic. Ladies and gentlemen, all of these millions of American children around this country are at risk for opioid addiction, and even worse. How can you treat opioid addiction if you're not treating the very kinds of conditions in the lives of young people that are more likely to lead them onto paths of total and complete despair? But we have not been factoring human despair. We have not been factoring deep anxiety. We have not been, in fact, this is why the Republicans were gobsmacked by Donald Trump. It's why the Democrats establishment were gobsmacked by the success of Bernie Sanders, because they were the only two people speaking to that economic despair. And I'm not really shocked that this country was not going to elect somebody who said, let's just keep going the way we're going. Because for someone who has been out there as much as I have been, I have registered for decades the level of that deep despair. By the way, I do believe that Hillary Clinton would have addressed it. I don't think that what I just said speaks to her heart or even speaks to her intentions would she have been president. But it speaks to the kind of strategy that anybody would have thought was a way to take the American people forward. My experience is that people are smart. My experience is that people are good. This is the country that elected Abraham Lincoln. And yet we have a political establishment that talks to people like we're stupid. That talks to people like all we care about is ourselves. Like all we care about is this one little thing that pertains to us. I don't believe that, ladies and gentlemen. Jared Kushner went into a McDonald's with his father-in-law. And he said to his father-in-law, according to him, there are a lot of angry people out there. And we could harness all that anger and make you president. What I see is while there are a lot of loving people out there, we could harness all that love and change this world. When that man killed those people at the mosque in New Zealand, let's look at that phenomenon. You have one person behaving in a wicked, heinous, evil way. His behavior having emerged from a wicked, heinous, evil philosophy. But you had millions of people all over the world praying, their hearts open in love for the people of New Zealand. Now, that is an interesting embodiment of a very important thing going on, not only throughout the world, but also in this country. Much fewer people hate than love. The problem in the world today and in this country is not that there are more haters than lovers, but that haters hate with conviction. Haters are very serious. Haters are very intentional. And there is someone who has harnessed hate and fear for political purposes. The problem is not that there are more haters than lovers. The problem is that lovers are not politicized. Lovers are not effective. Too often when we think of love in terms of personal. I want to be loved. I want to be a better person. We need to, at this point in our history, more than at any time in our history, think not only in terms of am I being a good person, but am I being a good country? Not just whether my actions are moral, but are our domestic policies moral? Are our international policies moral? Take those millions of American children. What do you call an individual who neglects a child in trouble? Unethical at best and criminal at worst. So what do you call a country that is systematically neglecting its children, its millions of American children? These children should be rescued, no different than we would rescue them from a natural disaster. And where is their right to pursue happiness? These children are trapped. These children are trapped. Where is their right to pursue happiness? And we know how this works. They're not old enough to vote, so they're not a constituency. And they're not old enough to work, so they have no financial leverage. So how can they possibly compete with the clout of major national corporations like Boeing? Why do you think we didn't have we took so long to ground the Boeing Max? Boeing paid $15 million alone last year in lobbying. At what point are the American people going to stand up? At what point are the American people going to begin to vote in candidates who are unequivocal about this? Unequivocal about this. And if I am president, there will be a U.S. cabinet level Department of Children and Youth. The really interesting thing that we all know, but we need to unabashedly face and acknowledge, is that none of this situation, which is actually promulgated under the conceit that, it's good for business to behave this way, to systematically remove massive amount of the American treasury into the hands of a very few. We're told that that's what business needs. Well, this is not economic theorizing that has anything to do with creating economic vibrancy, except for a few people. It has decimated, destroyed the American middle class. It has created the biggest wealth inequality since 1929. It has left a situation where 40% of Americans struggle just to make ends meet. And more than that, even, it has absolutely nothing to do with planning for economic vibrancy and abundance 10 years from now. It isn't, because it's a leeching from the system in the present. The way to plan for economic abundance and vibrancy in the United States economy 10 years from now is to take better care of your 10-year-olds today. We have been so trained to expect too little. We've been so trained to ask for too little. Those children are full-on citizens of the United States. They're full-on citizens of the United States, so their right to pursue happiness should be equal to everyone else's. And that's why, neurologists now tell us about everything that happens in the brain of a child 10 years old and younger. Children have neurological and cognitive and neuroplasticity. Our children and our grandchildren have abilities that we don't even have anymore. And that's why there should be a massive realignment of investment in the direction of America's children. If not only to do the right thing, to do the moral thing, but also to do the economically sound thing. And guess what country had figured that out? China. Countries that are actually planning, that actually do long-term planning, which we don't do because we're so short-term profits. Countries that are actually planning for long-term vibrancy, no. Direct your resources to your children, direct your resources to your children, direct your resources to your children. And there's another area, ladies and gentlemen, where our lack of real long-term thinking in favor of just really leeching from the system short-term corporate profits for right now has to do with our national security. Now, this is not a critique of our military. I have great respect for our military, and I think we all do, we all should. These things that I'm talking about are not decisions made by the military. They are decisions made by politicians. But just as our environmental policies have very little to do with protecting us and fighting climate change, and everything to do with providing for short-term profits for fossil fuel companies and chemical companies and big ag, etc., our national security agenda has very little to do, if anything, with planning peace on earth for our children and our children's children. Rather, like in every other area, our domestic agenda, our international, our safety agenda, our defense agenda is driven by short-term corporate profit maximization for Raytheon, for Lockheed Martin, for Boeing, and so forth. Not only was the first Secretary of State in this administration the ex-CEO of Exxon, not only is the head of our EPA an ex-chemical company executive, not only was the one before him an oil company lobbyists, but the acting head of our Defense Department was a 30-year executive at Boeing. So for every $1 that we spend on actually creating peace, we spend over $1,000 on preparing for war. Now, we need some integrative thinking here. You can't just fight sickness. You have to cultivate health. Sickness is the absence of health. Health isn't the absence of sickness. You can't just prepare for war. You have to cultivate peace. Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense under George Bush, talked about how we must wage peace. General Mattis, who was head of the Defense Department until recently, said, if you're not going to fully fund the State Department, I will have to buy more ammunition. War is the absence of peace. Peace is not the absence of war. And why don't we? Well, this is why we have to have some serious conversation among ourselves. We have to stop this superficial political talk. I'm not saying anything that every Democratic candidate doesn't know. I'm just saying it. And you might ask yourself why. We've got to get real. I have a career, and I have for 35 years, where healing is possible. Miracles happen. Love will heal anything, but you got to get honest. You got to get real. You got to actually face where you're not the person that you say you are. This country has to face the places where we're not living as who we say we are. We have to atone for the places where we need to atone, make amends where we need to make amends, actually admit to ourselves the exact nature of our national character defects. Then we can get to the other side of this. And until we do, ladies and gentlemen, all we're going to do is slow down the trajectory, and the trajectory is headed down. If you want to wage peace in the world, this is what you do. It's very, it's sociologically, it's not mysterious. This is how you wage peace. Number one, expand economic opportunities for women around the world. Number two, expand educational opportunities for children around the world. Number three, diminish violence against women. And number four, ameliorate unnecessary human suffering wherever possible. When those factors are present, guess what? There are greater rates of peace, lower rates of violence. But as we know, doing those things does not produce corporate profits. As a consequence, we have been diminishing the resources through state, etc., that have to do with expanding education for children, expanding economic opportunities for women, diminishing violence against women, etc., and putting more and more resources into our preparedness for war machine. I want to give you one example. It's an example, but a lot of times politicians don't want to upset you. They don't want to upset you, or if they tell you the bad news, they just want to say something that they think would win over another candidate. But I think we need to discuss these things. When Gandhi said politics should be sacred, I think what he meant was it needs to be real. We should have the same level of conversation here among us that you'd have with your spouse, with your child, or in therapy, or in a recovery group, or at church, or at synagogue, or at mosque. We're good people. We can handle the truth, but we have to deal with it. Okay, the U.S. Air Force has ordered 100 airplanes called the B-21 Raiders. Now, I just want you to hear about this airplane in case you haven't read about it. So the B-21 Raider, each one costs $550 million. And each one carries both conventional and nuclear weapons. Now, the founders said that you're the one, you, me, us, the wisdom in our hearts, when we have a free press, so we have all the information, and we had a free public education so that our critical thought process had been honed. This is the radicalism of democracy. The founders said, you when you just think, and you when you just think, and you when you just think, the wisdom that would emerge from that, that would be the power dependent upon to govern a great nation. So I'm asking you, why do we need 100 airplanes that carry nuclear bombs? Not military experts. You. Why do we need 100 airplanes that carry nuclear bombs? Because 5 of those, it's over for human civilization as we know it. If 5 of those drop, we don't have one nuclear bomb on the planet today. Or I'll say it this way, every nuclear bomb on the planet today makes the bombs that dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki look like a pinprick. So you drop 5 of those, ladies and gentlemen, it's over for human civilization as we know it. You drop 10 of those, it's over for humanity. At least, they say, for 250, 300,000 years. $550 million each. So you tell me, what's that for? Is that for preparing for peace? Or is that the aerospace industry and the nuclear industry? Come on, come on, come on. We just all got to wake up. This isn't about what they think. This is about what we think. And so these trajectories have absolutely nothing to do with preparing for peace. They have to do with preparing for war. So what kind of world are we giving to our children and to our children's children? Who among us wouldn't do anything to protect our children? Who among us wouldn't do anything to protect our grandchildren? And who among us wouldn't do anything to protect any child if we knew that that child was in trouble? You know, I know that here in New Hampshire, there's been enough experience of drug addiction and the consequences of drug addiction. And unfortunately, it's going on everywhere in this country enough that almost everybody has some sophisticated understanding now of how it works. Almost everybody understands that you start getting immoderate with your use of alcohol or drugs, and the survival of the physical body cannot be guaranteed. I believe that it's time for the American people to get out of our denial and to awaken from our magical thinking and to realize the survival of our democracy cannot be guaranteed either. And if the human race continues to act in such irresponsible ways, the future and the survival of the human species is not guaranteed either. These are very serious times, and we must be very serious people. And that doesn't mean that answers are all easy. You know, the American people are really good with a to-do list. You know, that's a characterological facet of the American mind. Just tell us what to do and we can do it. And that's cool, because we've done that in our past. This is not a moment where it's always so simple. This is not a moment where it's like a cancer that you can just excise. It's more like cancerous thinking that is metastasized and it's wrapped around some very, very healthy organs. So this is what I submit to you. I believe, perhaps you do as well, that the first thing we have to make sure of is that the Democrat wins in 2020. That, to me, is number one. And whether I'm the nominee or anyone else, I will be doing everything possible to make sure. But I will tell you this. I think it is very unsophisticated and even naive to think this is as simple as defeating Donald Trump. Donald Trump, as I see it, and what he represents in our country, is like an opportunistic infection. It could not have taken hold had we not become a weakened immune system. And each of us have to awaken to the fact that that's what citizenship is. No more farming out our conscience or farming out our politics. Too many Americans have become chronically disengaged from the political process. Maybe not so much in places like New Hampshire or Iowa or South Carolina or Nevada where you're so clear that you're part of it, but in too many places around this country. And we must rise to the occasion now as other generations have risen before. But if you think that all we need is somebody tough enough to take on Donald Trump, then I would suggest that you are not yet recognizing the true nature of this opponent. The only way to defeat dog whistles is to drown them out with angel voices. You know, every time there's a tragedy, we all put quotes from Martin Luther King on our screensavers. Every time there's a tragedy, we quote Martin Luther King on Twitter. We need to do more than quote him on Twitter. We need to hear what he said. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. When Abraham Lincoln talked about the angel of our better nature, Abraham Lincoln was speaking before the field of modern psychology had been invented. So in those days, he wasn't thinking of himself as speaking metaphorically. In those days, what you and I look at as racism, bigotry, anti-Semitism, homophobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia. That, you know what they would have called those things then? Demons. And when you look at things like love, tolerance, justice, compassion, you know what they would have called those things? Angels. And so we have to politicize our decency. We will not beat Trump by being angry. That is a low level of emotion. And this is what Democrats too often don't understand. The part of the brain that rationally analyzes an issue is not the same part of the brain that decides who to vote for. Rational analysis and appealing to people's reason is not what's going to defeat this president in 2020. What's going to defeat him at the poll, I hate to even use the word defeat, because it's not about defeating anyone except on an electoral level. It's about rising to the occasion, lifting the frequency of the conversation of our own nobility and our own dignity. We need, but the only thing strong enough when there is a politics of fear is to answer that with a politics of love. Someone has harnessed fear for political purposes, and we must harness love for political purposes. We need to make sure that we take care of these children, to have a Department of Children and Youth, to recognize that this generation must make a massive realignment of investment in the direction of our children. We must see things like universal health care, the $15 an hour minimum wage, the canceling of many of these college loans, and the providing of college to a vast number of Americans, regardless of whether or not they can afford it. We need it for a reason, not just because you deserve it or you deserve it, but because we need a massive infusion of hope in this country. We have been capping people's dreams. We're capping the dreams of these children. If you want to see the American spirit, if you want to see American genius, if you want to see the entrepreneurial spirit that could get this country back on its feet and make this country everything it could be, I'll tell you where you go. Go to any kindergarten in any neighborhood in America, because it's there. But we're the only country that bases our education funding on property taxes. So these kids in these poor neighborhoods don't get a decent education. And most of the people who are making our economic policies send their kids to private schools. So it's time for us to recognize this. We need to take care of these children. I believe we need to recognize that we need to take the next step in owning the real journey of racial reconciliation that we need to take in this country. After 2.5 centuries of slavery, and then followed by another century of institutionalized violence against blacks in America, in the 1960s, we passed civil rights legislation to dismantle segregation, and then voting rights legislation to ensure that black people would have equal voting rights. But in many ways, we have slid back. Since 2013, the Supreme Court started chipping away at the Voting Rights Act, which has opened the way to all these voter suppression efforts all over this country. We know who they're mainly aimed at: people of color and people of disenfranchised communities, mass incarceration, racial disparity in our criminal sentencing. In many ways, we're moving back. I believe the way to counter this is to move forward. Since World War II, Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations. It can't make the Holocaust not have happened, but paying reparations to Jewish organizations has been a primary factor in the ability of Germany to reconcile with the Jews of Germany and the rest of Europe. I believe it is time, as Martin Luther King said, people were freed, but what were they freed to? They were promised, every former slave family of 4 was promised 40 acres and a mule. Think about this, ladies and gentlemen. You were a slave, so you have a skill set, because you were running people's plantations. You have a skill set. You're free, but how are you going to make a living? Well, those 40 acres and a mule could have meant that you could do it. But as soon as the federal troops left in 1877, even in the cases where it had been given, it was taken back. The Southern legislatures passed what were called black code laws to ensure subpar economic and social and political opportunity for the former slaves. That economic disparity, that gap has never been closed. It has been systematized. I don't want to diminish or undervalue or in any way minimize the sacrifices, the struggles, or successes of any of our ancestors, black or white. but I believe it is time for our generation. You know, we need to go beyond small random acts of kindness. We need to do some huge strategized acts of doing the right thing. It would be a great gift to our children, our children's children. Let's do this. Let's pay reparations for slavery. And if I am president, creating peace, waging peace will be such a massive part of what I see as our responsibility to future generations. We need a peace creation agenda which is equal in robustness to our agenda of preparing for war if needed, not only in terms of the international factors I told you about, recognizing that desperate people are a national security risk, desperate people do desperate things, desperate people are more vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. That's true here in a corner of a city in the United States with gangs, and it's true internationally in a corner of the world when it comes to terrorist organizations. That's why ameliorating unnecessary suffering is so important internationally, but also we need domestic issues as well. And I would support a U.S. Department of Peace. We need wraparound services for these children, anti-trauma for these children. We need restorative justice. We need conflict resolution. Whether you're talking about a city of the United States or whether you're talking about peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, we need to move beyond a narrow conceptualization of politics, which just says if I tweak things on the outside, everything will be okay. We need an integrative model of politics, which includes factoring in how despair operates, how hope operates, and most importantly, how love operates. We need a massive infusion of love for our children, a massive infusion of love for each other, a massive infusion of love for the rest of the people in this world, which is the only way we will survive the next century. There is no doubt that this generation will be remembered. We will be remembered either with a, what were they thinking? Or we will be remembered as a generation who might have gotten there a little bit late when we were a little too close to the cliff, but once we got there, we slammed it. Let's slam it. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, ma'am, sure. Answer any questions that you have. Yes, sir. Thank you.
So, you're the President of the United States. Christchurch just happened.
What just happened?
Christchurch.
I'm sorry. Oh, the massacre.
The massacre in Christchurch just happened.
Christchurch, New
You're the
Zealand.
President of the United States. You're helping our country understand what we need to make of this. How would you help us understand what we need to make of this and how we can come to a new place?
In terms of what we need to understand, I think the American people understand. The biggest question is what we need to do. Now, when our president was asked what if he thinks that white nationalism is a problem, he said no, he doesn't think it's a problem, it's just a few crazy people. I feel very differently, but I think the majority of people think very differently. The problem is not with the American people. So when you say, what do I need to make the American people understand? My sense is the American people understand. The issue is, President, is what are you going to do? The U.S. intelligence agencies have been telling us this is a serious problem, and they've been telling us this for a long time. The U.S. intelligence agencies are not naive about this. U.S. intelligence agencies have been talking about it, and unfortunately, with this particular presidency, many of the programs that were in place and could be in place to actually deal with these things, the support for them has been withdrawn. So as President of the United States, I feel that my position would be what I believe millions of Americans know. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a Jew. Nobody needs to tell me about the danger of collectivized hatred. Nobody needs to tell anybody who has any knowledge of history, even the knowledge of history in this world over the last 20 years, the danger of collectivized hatred. The problem is the same problem for why the United States was the last advanced nation to ground the Boeing MAX. Boeing had paid $15 million. So the issue is not that the American people do not understand. The issue is that we need an American president, which, by the way, I hope would be true if any Democrat wins this election, or any even you know what I'm trying to say, that there would be the full support of the executive branch for the recognition among our intelligence and criminal justice agencies. You know, when I lived in Michigan, I had a friend, a Republican woman actually, who was she was on the Supreme Court, a justice on the Supreme Court in Michigan, and she was fabulous on the issue of children and violence against children. And I was privy to a phone call that I was only privy to because the FBI was talking to her because she was a Supreme Court justice. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been privy to this. And she was asking about about sex trafficking and so many of the things with children. The problem is not that we don't know. The problem is what we don't fund. Now, I mean, let's just all be real here. And these FBI agents were talking to her. I mean, they have very sophisticated understanding and knowledge. Even sex trafficking. Sex trafficking is a $91 billion industry in this country. It has even infused our foster care system. So my impression when I talk to people in the police, people in criminal justice, my sense is not that they don't know about any of this. It has to do with budgets, and it has to do with whether or not we are funding the things which will actually create peace. Because who is going to be making the profits? See, this is the deal we have to recognize. This is what happens with dark money. It's not enough. You and I are showing up every 2 years, every 4 years to cast a vote, but these major corporate lobbyists are showing up every single day. So sometimes Americans have to be kind of awakened into the seriousness of a problem. So as an American president, I would acknowledge what I believe millions of Americans already know. You know, I remember when I was in Amsterdam, Holland, and we don't want to change this. I mean, I had visited Anne Frank's house, and most of the Nazi literature in the world comes from Nebraska because of our free speech laws. Now, I'm not suggesting we change those laws, by the way. This is not an easy call. But you know, in many countries, it's illegal after World War II to print these things. But now on the social media, it's out there anyway. Right? So I do not underestimate. Evil can happen anywhere. No country is immune. And this is, you know, New Zealand is one of the most peaceful, loving countries in the world. I have tremendous respect for Jacinda Ardern. In fact, Jacinda Ardern, who's the Prime Minister of New Zealand, has said her goal is to make New Zealand the best country in the world for a child to live. And I just can't wait to make that phone call. You're on, girlfriend. You're on. It's going to be one fun competition with you. And so that is the answer, sir. I would affirm for the American people that I think that's what leadership is. And once again, there are people who think politics should be about, I don't want to upset you too much. Well, to me, what's upsetting me is the feeling that we're not talking about it and just dealing. So I have, from everything I've read about white nationalism, collectivized, and you know, we've seen enough. We've seen enough, and we know this could happen anywhere. I believe what I would like as an American citizen is to know that the president is on it, and the president is giving the full powers of the executive branch of the U.S. government to the appropriate measures that can be taken. We don't want to mess with our freedoms, et cetera. We all know that this is an art form here, but with me, you would have a president who does not underestimate the dangers of this kind of collectivized hatred.
Hi. Oh, we have a question from our friends in Utah, and then we'll come back to this audience. So our friends in Utah have looked at your website, and they've noticed that you talk about being supportive of LGBTQ rights. Their legislature has been discussing conversion therapy a great deal. Yes, Weber State at Utah. Given that, can you speak about the practice of conversion therapy?
Well, first of all, I don't think the government, other than the injunction of sex against, not having sex with children, which I think is universally, we would all agree. Other than that, the idea of the government ever telling anybody what they have to do or cannot do with their body is anathema to me. In terms of conversion therapy, for me personally, to me it feels like a denial of one's being. But if someone, and the idea of the government, what would the government say? They would make it what? They're not going to make it mandatory. I mean, that would be so unconstitutional. But what would they be talking about doing on a governmental level with conversion therapy? Pardon? I personally find it anathema, and re-legalizing it, well, it's legal if somebody wants it. It's been outlawed? Listen, I believe, democracy, there's an art form here. Nobody owes it to you to agree with you. That's really important. And a smug, self-righteous, intolerant left-winger is no less dangerous to the emotional fabric of this country than a smug, self-righteous, intolerant right-winger. So some things, if people want it, they want it. If they're not hurting someone. Really, that's what a free society is. A free society is somebody doesn't have to agree with you. But the idea of government getting in there, I can't even imagine what that would even look like.
So they're talking about outlawing conversion therapy.
They would outlaw conversion therapy?
Yeah.
Well, this is if the people outlawing it.
Yeah.
So are you talking about conversion therapy about transgender?
No.
Or about the thing about gay to straight?
Right. Yes.
How could they outlaw it?
Outlaw the therapy of converting people who think they're LGBT.
See, as lefty as I am, I think on the left as well as on the right, we need to be concerned, what's government doing telling people? If somebody, the idea of forcing a child, I would have definite, but if someone is over 18 and they want it, I'd have to think long and hard about saying, I think sometimes we're so desperate to want things done that we feel are ethical, that we are too vulnerable to just saying, well, let government handle that. Let's government make it illegal. You want to be careful, because if you're on the left and you want government to make things illegal that you think are wrong, then there are going to be people on the right who want to make government make things illegal that they think are wrong. So I would be very careful with that. If that is my answer, I'd be very, very careful with that. We have to there's some things, government cannot legislate morals. And so what we have to do is reclaim our ethics and reclaim our moral core and reclaim the notion that doing the right thing is what's important. And I'd be very careful with getting in there with government every time you feel somebody's doing something that you don't like. That's how I... Yes, ma'am. And then that young man, I want to make sure. Yes, ma'am.
Well, it feels like a dangerous time where, because there's such divisiveness between in this country that you can't talk to each other, and it feels like with the president actually inciting people to actually become violent when things aren't going. He just did it the other day with motorbikers or something like that. I heard you on the radio the other day, and they were asked a question about talking to people on the other side, and you had a really good answer, which I can't remember. But you weren't saying we belittle people, we recognize their differences, but how do we deal with each other when we have such divisiveness? Labels make us divisive. They use socialism, so we can't talk, well, you're a liberal, you're this, and we don't talk about the issues. Then people get stuck on the label, and we're not talking about the issues behind the label. How do we get, that's what you're saying, we have to get to the meat of the issues, not the surface.
People used to say, I'd go someplace and people would say things like, well, we're not going to talk about religion or politics, okay? And I was so like, that so leaves me out at dinner. I think that our problem in America is that we've become too much in the habit of talking about ultimately unimportant things. And that's one of the reasons that we got to a place where we can't have a rational political conversation, is because we weren't having enough rational political conversations when we could. We lost the habits of democracy. De Tocqueville talked about the habits of democracy. And too many young people have been raised. I remember many years ago, I was at the Capitol in Washington with Dennis Kucinich. This shows how long ago this was, because Lindsey Graham got on an elevator. And I went, ugh. And Kucinich said, what? He's a great guy. And I remembered him from the Clinton, how bad he was, about Clinton and the Monica Lewinsky. And so I told Dennis all my impressions of Lindsey Graham based on what I'd seen on television. And Dennis said, "Oh, Marianne, that's just TV." He said, "That's a great guy. We work together all the time." And Dennis was such a lefty. He said, "We work together all the time. He's a great guy. That's just on TV." That infuriated me. Because it shouldn't be that way if that's on TV. Because that's what has, that kind of crossfire thing on television created, we have a younger generation. Some of us are old enough, we talk about how Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan used to have a drink together at the end of the evening. We have a whole generation of Americans who've grown up, they don't remember that, they never knew about that, and they never saw that. So all of us have to take responsibility. And that's why I said, when Gandhi said politics should be sacred. I've been doing what I do for 35 years, and probably the night I remember more than any other was in Sacramento, California. I don't know if it was in the late 80s or the early 90s, I can't remember which. 2,000 people were in the audience, and somebody brought up the topic of abortion. And if you want to feel a psychic tear in the room, have somebody start talking about abortion. My first thought was, let's get off the topic as fast as possible. My second thought was, but we're here for healing. And because it was in the part of my career where I could talk about it in religious and spiritual terms, I said, God doesn't need anybody's press release here. And I think I might have mentioned something along the line of Rumi's line, out beyond all ideas of good and bad, right or wrong, there is a field, I'll meet you there. And I said, let's everybody just close our eyes and be silent for 2 minutes. And whatever your view is on the topic, just give it up. Become very empty mind, Zen mind, empty mind. The universe doesn't need you to run in there with your opinion. We've become a nation of bad listeners. So I said, just give it up and go into an empty place. What happened in that room after those 2 minutes was so profound that a young man said to me the next day, he said, I feel like last night I had an intimate conversation about abortion in my living room with 2,000 people. Because the space had been created. And people spoke about why they were pro-choice from such a profound level. People spoke about why they were not pro-choice from such a profound level. And there was no question in my mind but that some pro-choice people heard some things maybe they needed to hear. And some I don't want to call it pro-life because I don't think pro-life people are any more pro-life than us pro-choice people are, heard things we had not heard. From a spiritual perspective, the answer is that level of conversation. From a spiritual perspective, it's just that we can hear each other at that level. Then new answers arise. There are groups that cultivate this. There are groups of nonviolent communication skills, common ground. There are all kinds of organizations working. I've worked a lot with racial healing groups in my career. And I feel, to be honest, ma'am, I think, many people say that I'm not qualified to run for president because I don't have the qualification, which is experience as a politician, as we now see politicians. My view of that is that experienced politicians took us into Vietnam. Experienced politicians took us into Iraq. A bunch of philosophers didn't do that. And I don't believe that the mindset that got us into this ditch is the mindset that's going to get us out. And the mindset of someone whose professional expertise is cultivating that deeper level of conversation is a skill set that is a qualification that I believe is necessary for this time in our history. Yes. Hello, Janet. We have known each other since high school.
Thank you for coming to Keene.
Thank you.
For answering all these questions. I heard what you said about Donald Trump not being the only boogeyman.
Not being what?
Not being the only bad guy, and that there is a systemic problem. If you were to gain the nomination, how would you confront Donald Trump? And recognizing that you are coming at this from a different perspective, would you get down in the weeds? Would you not get down in the weeds?
The American people do not need me to tell them who Donald Trump is. The American people do not need me to show them who Donald Trump is. Michelle Obama got the truth. They go low, you go high. I remember when Ronald Reagan, enough of us are old enough to remember, what did Ronald Reagan used to say? Oh, there they go again. My desire would be to make him irrelevant. I see this as simply having been an unfortunate episode in our history. Let us close this chapter and move on to the wonderfulness that we know this country can be. Every time you talk about him, you actually increase his power. And he has made it very clear that the only thing that scares him is somebody none of us have ever heard of. And when David defeated Goliath because he hit him in the third eye, the one place where Donald Trump is defenseless is if you start bringing up issues of conscience. You just call upon the conscience of the American people. You call upon the nobility of the American people. There are people who are going to vote for Trump no matter what. So there's no point in even trying to figure it. They're going to vote for Trump. That's not what happened that was so dangerous in this country. What happened in 2016 was how many people who were really good, decent people. Well, I'm not saying that they weren't good. I don't even want to go there that the people voted for him aren't good, decent people. But people who, I think that there are enough people who voted for him who are at least disturbed, who are at least open to a more compelling vision of what's possible. We need to create a new birth of freedom. We need to create such a compelling vision for what's possible in this country that people simply are drawn elsewhere. That's what I would do, Janet. I would not try to get down. This idea of a cowboy who's tough enough to take him on is I think, very naive. And that's what I would seek to do, to create to talk about the America that we could have and that we are. And they just forget for a moment about Donald Trump. Yes, sir, in the back there.
Hi, Marianne. So, hi there. So what you're saying is true, I believe, and profound and wonderful. And if you get the nomination, you'll likely win. In order to get the nomination, I think you're going to have to defeat a lot of myths. I don't know if defeat is the right word you'd like to use, but you're going to have to contend with the one I would like to focus on is the myth of comfort. The idea that those people who you correctly say are in despair themselves are not necessarily aware that they're in despair because they have a flat screen TV and the $1,000, oh well, because they have a credit card and it's maxed out, but we'll get along. And so what I'm trying to point to is how do you reach, I'll go at it another way. How do you reach the New York Times version of reality that says that probably hasn't even mentioned you? I've been looking for you on the New York Times. That is going to, how do you reach the center, you might say, that's going to put these ideas that you're putting into circulation, give them enough momentum that you might have a chance.
Donald Trump is president. So no one can say what can happen. The idea that so-and-so could win, so-and-so couldn't win, or we could in any way predict anything, those days are over. I mean, Donald Trump is president. So I believe, I'm not trying to figure out what to say to this group or figuring out what to say to that group. I'm not trying to talk to the black, the white, the gay, the straight, the rich, the poor, the Muslim, the Jew, the Christian, the agnostic, the atheist. I'm talking to the American in people. I want to talk to the American in all of us. And I believe that when we seek to do the right thing with our right by people, to do right by people, that brings your policies into alignment with that which serves people. And that's what I want to speak of. Not trying to figure out what that group needs to hear or what that group needs to hear. First of all, it's corrupt to me to do that. I'm not here to try to play that game. In fact, that would be terrible for me. That, in my world, that would make people, oh, it's too bad about what happened to Marianne. I'm here to seek to speak a deep, authentic, fierce truth as passionately and articulately as I can. I then trust the American people. I trust the American people. I want to put out to you, this is how I see it, and this is what I would do if I were president. The rest is up to you. There's something really profound about that. There's something very profound. So, sir, I'm just speaking, I've lived a life that has taken me to many, many places. I've been in palaces, I've been in prisons. I've spoken to the people who have it the easiest, I've spoken to the people who have it the hardest. No socioeconomic group has a monopoly on values. No socioeconomic group has a monopoly on intelligence. I want to speak to the noble. I want to speak to the goodness. I want to speak to the dignity. And I want to speak about American politics and what I feel where the country has swerved from our ethical center, where capitalism has swerved from its ethical center, where our country has swerved from its ethical center. And I want to, my father was a lawyer, and he used to say, speak to the smartest person on the jury. I've had a successful career, expecting people to join with me in a noble conversation. And then what group buys it, doesn't buy it, I'm not living, that to me is it's the anti-strategy strategy. And where it would land really is in the hands of the American people. I think there's something beautiful about that. I'm totally accepting of that. If I have a chance to speak my truth, and that's why I have a problem with CNN not giving me a town hall yet. I have a problem with MSNBC not having me on. I have a problem with the self-appointed gatekeepers. I have a problem with that as an American. It's not just about me as an American, that the Democratic Party establishment or the media or anyone, anybody saying they're running for president. When somebody tells you who's running for president and they don't mention me, that is fake news.
Yes.
So all I'm asking is that I can be in there. That's why I'm hoping you will help me. Even with a $1 donation would be one of the unique contributions that I need 65,000 of in order to be in the DNC debates. I'm going to speak my heart's truth. I'm going to tell you what I think and what I say. And I feel trusting that if I can be in those debates and I can be a contender and I can be given the opportunity by the media and the establishment to have my voice in there, that I'm going to do that as best I can, and then the rest is up to you, and that's how it should be in America. So. Now this gentleman has had his hand up. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, that one and then that one. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
My name is Jackson. I'm with the New Hampshire Youth Movement. You talked about the importance of reparations, and according to me, from what I've seen, you're the only politician running for president that is running on a plan for reparations. I just wanted you to discuss the details of your policies and also how you plan to
job training, and you know what? The statistics are really bad around job training, because we can give these people job training. That doesn't mean that there are jobs for them. And with automation, the problem that we have, let's say you go into a drugstore today, right? We've all seen this, but it takes you a while to really register it. Or if you're at an airport, what happened to the waiters? What happened to the waitresses? Well, it's all on the iPads now. You go into a drugstore. Okay, so you go into a drugstore. There used to be 8 people at the counter. Now there are 10 people at the counter because you're going to go do it at the computer. Where are those people going to get jobs? It's not like if you're a clerk at a drugstore and you lose your job at Rite Aid, you could go then get another one at Duane Reade, because Duane Reade also went automated. So the only issue that's problematic about a job guarantee, that's why making it part of a Green New Deal type thing is a good idea. But even that, I fear, is not enough. And that's why there's another man running for president. I'm sure you will hear him at some point, Andrew Yang. I read his book, The War on Normal People. And I have become a convert. I think we should be having a serious conversation about universal basic income, which takes it one step forward. Because otherwise, and by the way, I want to tell you something that I find very interesting that I did not know till I read this in another book. I always thought Milton Friedman was the big, everything is because of Milton Friedman. He did this to us. He came up with this theory of unshackle market forces, get government out of it, and let them do whatever they want. Well, you know what? He was also for universal basic income, because Milton Friedman knew that you can't unleash the market and not take care of people. You can't leave that part out. So my sense of a universal job, as great as it sounds, a job guarantee, what you need is the money guarantee. And that's why, even though I love the idea of a Green New Deal, not necessarily the Green New Deal, but a Green New Deal that creates all these jobs, without a way to have these jobs, just a government guaranteeing them of itself is not enough. I'm open to anything. What I'm open to is anything that gives a massive infusion of hope. You think we have, I think when you read what's really happening economically in this country, ladies and gentlemen, what we've got in front of us, what we've had behind us in terms of the recession is nothing compared to what we will have in front of us if we do not provide an opportunity for these people. So I would go all the way, and I would support the universal basic income.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Americans are dying of going bankrupt.
Who is?
Americans,
Yes.
many, because of the for-profit industries in healthcare.
Yes.
And how, as president, would you implement an expanded healthcare program that really would provide?
Medicare, we already have Medicare. It works. That's one of the arguments against it. Everybody makes it like it would be so complicated. We could do it. Medicare works. We know how to do it. It's just Medicare for all. It's basically, I remember when Bernie first said it, and he said it should be like Denmark, and Hillary said, but we're not like Denmark. He should have challenged her on that, because it's just a bunch of states. So it should be simple. That part of it. I'm a fairly intelligent woman, and I find it also complicated sometimes. So even figuring out where to vote, it shouldn't be complicated. I want the American people to be free to spend time with their families. I want people, it's not even that people should have universal health care. You should have it for a reason, so that you can get to the business of living, the business of creating and being productive and coming up with ideas and raising your children and starting businesses and being joyful and raising your grandchildren. I want it simple. That's why I want universal health care. That's why I want, too many Americans don't know what they'll do if they get sick. And they don't know what they'll do if their kids get sick. And they don't know how they're going to send their kids to college. And they don't know how they're going to pay these college loans. Everything we need to be the most vital economy, unshackle people. And that's why I don't want a complicated system. I want a simple system. You get sick, you go to the doctor, handled. And the American people have been so trained into expecting so little. We have to remind ourselves, we are the richest country in the world. And we've been trained to, pretty please, may I? Could I please? It's like anything, it's for a country, it's just like for an individual, it's where do you spend your money? Well, if you're going to spend your money on a $2 trillion tax cut, where 83 cents of every dollar goes to the very richest and the major corporations, we really do end up without the money we need to spend on people. It's a decision we make. So I don't, it's kind of like when you have a child, and any parent knows that there comes a time, and it's appropriate at times, that you tell your children something's going to happen because I say so. Because Mama says so. And if you ask me, we need a mother in the White House, and you can take that however you want. Yes, sir.
Hi, I've been wondering how you would work with Republicans, because you're sure to get a lot of resistance from many of them. For example, back when Mitch McConnell was the minority leader in the Senate, he flat out publicly said that he would want to keep Obama as a one-term president. And as we've seen, he's doing everything he can to protect Trump, and he would certainly try to do everything he could to just undermine you. So I'm wondering how you would deal with that sort of thing?
First of all, I hope that if there are any Republicans in the room, I feel that the Democratic Party needs to reclaim its soul, but the Republican Party has to reclaim its soul as well. I hope that good Republicans and really moderate, high-minded conservatives are reclaiming their party. I hope that, I'm not a Republican, but I hope for the sake of the country that the best of the Republican Party will present itself again. My hope would be, if I were president, my hope would be that Mitch McConnell would not be the head of the Senate. My hope would be that it would be a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House. I would not be looking forward to going in there and having that constant type of obstruction, obviously. But as people, one of the reasons why I submit to you, I think I'd be a very good idea as the nominee. I can't tell you how many Republicans say, I'm a Republican, but I vote for you, because, as my friends in South Carolina keep saying, well, I'm a Republican, I know you're liberal, but you're a woman of God. So I try to practice what I preach. I do think Eisenhower, he said it and he was correct. The American mind at its best is both liberal and conservative. High-minded conservatives would not have they might have a disagreement with me about policy, but they would certainly not find me disrespectful of their principles. The corporatism in America today is neither conservative nor liberal. Those people would have a problem with me. And having said that, I don't want to go to Washington and fight for you. I want to go to Washington and create with you. I want to do in Washington what you need to do here in New Hampshire. Because there needs to be an awakening that goes way beyond just the federal government. It needs to happen inside all of us and in local communities. I've said to some audiences, I want the American woman to start saying things like, I'm going to a city council meeting on Thursday night, you want to come? We have to make citizenship cool again. And so until that kind of revitalization, we need to repair the fabric of our civic society, and no one president can do that. That's a job all of us are going to have to take care of. Okay, then you choose who it is, because...
Hi, my name's Janera. I'm from here in New Hampshire. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. Under President Obama's presidency, Julian Assange was viewed as a beacon of knowledge and dropping all these bombs on the Republican Party, and as hope for freedom of speech, and someone we look to for acknowledging that we were committing atrocities all around the world. And now all of a sudden you see well, not all of a sudden, but he's been in asylum, he can't leave, he's in ill health, and the current administration right now really wants to prosecute him. And I'd like to know how you feel about that in light of Chelsea Manning now being put back in jail because she won't roll over on him, essentially.
Julian Assange, there are only two issues where I think of myself as a person, I know what I think, this is my view, this is it. There are two issues where I see both sides. That one and vaccines. I see both sides.
Vaccines is a bigger problem. Campaign trail too.
Well, I think freedom of speech is a much larger problem.
I don't know, Sweden has its own problem with Julian Assange. The rape charges against him.
That was found to be not.
So you obviously think that any kind of effort to get at Julian Assange is wrong, right?
WikiLeaks has the Australian equivalent of a Nobel Peace Prize. Julian Assange, to me, is a hero. He simply goes through information that is given to him. He makes sure it's 100% accurate. They have 100% accuracy rating, hence why he won the equivalent of the Nobel Peace Prize. And now we want to vilify him in American politics now because he dropped all kinds of bombs on the Democratic Party. And I feel like because he was viewed as an angel under Obama, and now he's horrendous because he dropped some serious bombs on what the DNC was doing to Bernie. And to be frank, that's why I went to Philadelphia and I rallied for Bernie, because what we're doing in light of freedom of speech is wrong. I mean, they're silencing people on Twitter. They're silencing people on Facebook. There's all this corporate entities like Henry Kissinger is part of the Atlantic Council, and he is literally part of this group on Facebook that's censoring what they deem as fake news. That to me is really limiting the scope of what we're going to be able to talk about. And I think if you don't acknowledge Julian Assange, and to be frank, the only other candidate who did acknowledge anything about Julian Assange is Tulsi Gabbard, and I like her a lot too, and I just think that that really needs to be addressed, and no one wants to touch that. No one wants to touch it.
Definitely, I mean, when I am one of those people who used to think he was a total hero, and kind of has begun to wonder over the last few years. But I hear, how many, I'm curious.
Maybe you've been lied to
Pardon?
about him. Maybe you've
Exactly.
been lied to about him. Based on his illegal White House entities. Obama, jail for whistleblowers.
So,
than anybody else.
yeah, there's a real argument to me that Obama's presidency isn't going to be as strong in history as it was at its time. Leaving that aside, I think one of the things I've thought about Assange for years is that from a free speech point of view, I'm really right with you. He, as a person, appears to be a chaos agent. He doesn't really care what he's blowing
That's
up.
exactly
And so
right.
I'm not really a fan of him as a person. I'm not a fan of the government silencing him,
Right.
but I'm really not into the chaos agents of
Yeah.
the world right now.
This gentleman speaks.
So I really appreciate the issue, and especially the depth that you're bringing it to this conversation.
Yeah, I think that really names it for me as well.
Is chaos, and I think
If you're gonna drop knowledge bombs on people, you have to do it on both sides of the aisle, because we can't pretend that everything was hunky-dory under Obama, and I voted for him twice. And he's dropped more bombs than any other president.
Oh yeah, he was not.
You gotta be real with this information. And the fact that we want to prosecute him now because he's not the little angel that we said he was under Obama's presidency, it's not, to me, it's complete, it's just,
I think when you elect a president, no president that you elect is going to agree with you on everything. I think that part of, and I say this, and I'm a citizen, I'm going to be electing like everybody else. And I think that we elect a president based on the consciousness that we feel that that person will bring to the decision making. So on that, whether or not we agree on every issue or not, I hope that you feel that I presented to you the consciousness, the worldview, and the mindset that I would bring to decision making. And I'm honored that you gave me this chance to speak and to your listening. Thank you very much. Thank you.